How you doing?
Great, thanks. Thanks for having me. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Excited about our chat and loved your book Conscious. And you talk about in the beginning of the book as a kid being curious, and you share a story about how you'd lay on your back, look up at the sky, and you'd contemplate your connection to the universe, which is really deep thinking for a kid. So I'm curious, what age was this? And then where was that instilled in you?
I think some kids are just naturally this way. I think a lot of kids actually. Most of the people that I now surround myself with, we kind of bond about what we were like as kids. Um, and so, I mean, that particular experience of lying down on the ground that you were talking about, I describe in my book. That was a very specific, and I used to. Sorry, I'm just moving something. I used to do a kind of a range of things like this. Sometimes just to play with my intuitions, just because I thought it was interesting. But this specifically was to help me viscerally understand something I had learned, but went against my intuition. So I had learned, so I was probably the first time 6 or 7 years old. I had learned that we are on planet Earth and we're orbiting the sun. And I was given, a fuller picture of our place in the universe and our place in the solar system. And it went against my intuition that the world was flat. I don't think I had an idea. I don't think I ever thought the world was flat, but I suddenly just realized, wow, the circumstance I'm in is so different from the one I feel I'm in. And I wanted to feel it the correct way. And so it was really about part of it was just getting kind of an expansive view so that I could see the horizon line from my peripheral vision, so that I could feel the sense that I was kind of on this sphere with, the universe and outer space out there. And I was also always very interested in gravity, the fact that this force was pushing me against the earth. And so I just kind of found this position that I could lie in my backyard where I could really get that feeling and break through my everyday intuition and to feel this kind of deeper sense of what the reality was.
Deep thinking from a young girl.
Yeah, I was recently, so I'm working on this audio series about consciousness, and I've been interviewing all kinds of people for it. And I interviewed this wonderful documentarian. She's actually now working on Lucy Walker is her name. She's now working on a documentary with Michael Pollan about research in psychedelics. Um, and she and I kind of bonded over this experience as children of really wanting to understand this deep curiosity, wanting to understand what the universe was made of, how we got here, what's going on. And she said it. I won't quote her exactly. I can't remember the quote exactly, but she said, "Yeah, didn't you just feel like looking at the adults in your life and saying, okay, I understand. We eat breakfast, we get dressed, we go to school, but is anyone trying to figure out what's going on here? Like what is this place? Where are we? How did this all come to be?" And she called that the trippy kids. We were the trippy kids who were always kind of thinking like, okay, when are you going to tell us what's actually going on here?
It's like the rest of
Um,
us are all just too busy to think these deeper thoughts and to further investigate.
Maybe, but I think probably more kids do that kind of thing than not. In my work teaching meditation to children, it always surprises me the types of things they're thinking about when you really just sit down. I don't know that anyone ever asked me. As a kid, no one would have known I was doing anything like that. So you have to ask the kids to find out what's going on in there. But they're interesting creatures at that age when they're just starting to understand the world.
I'm definitely a deep thinker at this point in my life, but I don't think it goes back that far. Probably more so in my teens. I'm curious though, talk more about teaching the kids. How did you get involved in that and how old are the kids?
So I originally got involved in it actually when I had been meditating for many years, but I became a much more serious meditator in my early 20s. I was probably about 22 or 23 when I sat my first meditation retreat, which was a 10-day silent meditation retreat where that's all you're doing 24/7. And I had some of the most concentrated and deepest and transformative experiences in meditation on that retreat than I had ever had before. And it suddenly dawned on me at some point how wonderful it would have been to have learned these skills as a child, and how in how many ways it could have helped me. And so it just that thought just coming up kept coming up for me throughout this retreat. And um, so I came out of that retreat just kind of with this goal or this dream that I really thought was a ridiculous dream. Like, of course, we're never going to be able to teach meditation to children, but I just thought if there's some way to do this, we teach, it's mandatory for children to receive physical education in school. Why isn't it mandatory to teach them how to use their minds in this way? It's as important to mental health as PE is to physical health. And so I did kind of just set this intention. I had no idea how it would happen. That I wanted to, if possible, find a way to get people to start teaching this to children in schools. And shortly after that, my husband, I think it was at a neuroscience conference, met Susan Kaiser Greenland, who it turns out had had this epiphany about 10 years before I had. And actually, but before that happened, I asked many meditation teachers that I knew, and I knew quite a few at that point. Nobody knew anyone working with kids. And so, anyway, my husband met Susan Kaiser Greenland on this retreat, um, and said, I need to introduce you to my wife. She wants to find, someone who's teaching meditation to children. And Susan had just started adapting on her own, really, because she had this same feeling. Um, these traditionally Buddhist teachings of Vipassana, it's called, and translating them into a completely secular program and exercises so that children could learn these skills of meditation and concentration. And I immediately I met with her. I said, I'll volunteer in whatever capacity you need. And she ended up training me to become a teacher. And then I volunteered for many years teaching her program. And then because I'm a writer and in publishing, she and I ended up publishing a project together called the Mindful Games activity cards. I first helped her turn all of these uh, exercises that she had created for children, and turn her whole thinking around her program into a full curriculum that we were able to get down on paper. And then we edited that down further so that we could create these cards so that teachers and parents could more easily implement the curriculum with their children.
That's incredible. So is this actually fully integrated into the school system?
In many schools, it is actually. Many schools are actually taking this program of hers. It's originally her organization is called the Inner Kids Organization, so it's the Inner Kids curriculum, and many schools across the world actually are using her curriculum to teach meditation to children. But of course, by now you've probably heard there are I don't know 5 or 6 different ones that have now sprung up. It's interesting because when I first started volunteering for her, I was teaching in public schools twice a week. Second grade and fourth grade are the grades I was assigned to. It was such a fringe thing. It was not the way that it is now. It was not a popular thing. It was not a secularized thing. And so many parents actually pulled their kids out of my class because they were worried we were teaching religion. We never used the word meditation because it sounded too religious. And we used the word mindfulness. And of course, now, the word mindfulness, I see it on my gym, and, when they're selling smoothies, it's become so mainstream that it's not an issue. But the wonderful thing about that is that many people have now invested in creating more programs. And yeah, there are many schools that incorporate it into their curriculum.
Talk about how the kids respond. I'm so curious as a child, it would have been such a foreign concept to me as a young kid. How do they respond? And at what age do you find they actually get it and they can see the value in doing this?
So I would say that every class I taught, which must have been hundreds now at this point, I was surprised by something a child said. So, first of all, Susan did an incredible job of turning these into games. It doesn't seem foreign to the kids at all, really. And the truth is, what I discovered, it was my intuition, but I discovered that it was, in fact, true that children learn to meditate much more easily and much more quickly than adults do. And it's a much more natural thing for them to do than it is for adults to do. And so they take to it fairly easily. And it's like any other skill, any other talent. There are kids, you notice after a couple of classes, there are kids who just clearly have a talent for it. They jump right in, they get it, they start saying things that really surprise me, insights they're having that show me that they're clearly meditating already, even after a couple of classes. And then there are kids who take a lot longer or who just never really take to it. But to some degree, they're all learning the skill. And so, we do very simple things, just, following one breath. Um, and actually, even before we'll sit down and do something more concentrated like that, we play games. And one of my favorite games that I used to always begin my classes with is an eye contact game. And it's a simple game. It's very similar to how they would call it morning circle in preschool or something like that, where the children sit in a circle. And the idea is just to get them to be present when they're speaking to each other and to make good eye contact, to just have that moment where they're not distracted by anything. They're just speaking to each other. And so it's a very simple exercise. They go around the circle, they turn to the person to their right and say, good morning, and then the color of their eyes. Good morning, Susan, your eyes are blue. And then that person would turn to the next person and they go around. And because they're noticing the color, it gets them to connect, to make eye contact in a way that they normally wouldn't. And it brings up all kinds of feelings. You see them in the beginning, they're giggling and they can't sit still. And all we do really is talk about what the experience is like. And so it brings them into the present moment in a way that they're not used to. And they notice all kinds of like little micro moments that would normally just pass by, and uncomfortable feelings that they would maybe just try to ignore or work through, or kind of get to the other side of. And in this case, they're just being with them. So it makes me feel nervous when I look into Mark's eyes and what does that feel like? And what does nervous even mean? And do you feel it in your fingers? Do you feel it in your chest? What does that feel like in your body? And they notice how they feel similarly to other people in the room. They get very connected to each other through this experience. But it's really each of these games have kind of many levels to what it helps teach the children. But the thing that's common in all of them is it's getting them to pay really close attention to what's going on in their experience in the present moment.
And for somebody out there who wants to apply something like this game you talked about at home with one of their children, what is the best way to get started? And at what age would you say somebody can consider implementing something like this?
I was surprised at how young you can start. Susan actually always worked with really little ones, and I didn't think I could do it, honestly. So I would always say, don't place me in a class younger than second grade. Second grade's the youngest I can work with. Once my daughter started preschool, their preschool asked me to come in and work with them, and I really said, I'm not sure if this is possible. We'll see what happens. They were, I think, 4 years old, um, and it was, again, I was just blown away. It was just as effective as the older kids. It was different. But they were absolutely able to learn how to meditate and were reporting back all kinds of insightful things about their practice. So these mindful games activity cards, that's really what they're for. And they come with a little instruction booklet. And so you can get started that way. I also have made all of my guided meditations available for free on my website since the beginning of the pandemic. That was one thing I just felt like small thing I could offer. But so on my website, there are my guided meditations. There's kind of the order in which I think they should be taught. And it begins with a set of instructions. And so I give instructions and tips and advice for how to get started.
I can only imagine the head start kids would have starting 4 years old or even 6, 8 years old. And even doing in just a small way, not, taking this on as some hardcore thing, but just introducing it to kids and letting them be present and understand the basic principles.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, something just as simple as being with an uncomfortable feeling and just letting that be okay can be hugely transformative, and they get it. I get emails and sometimes these beautiful texts in the middle of the day with a photo attached of someone's daughter, sitting in their backyard or sitting in their room. They start, and I don't tell them to do it outside of the class, but they once they start to notice the effect it has, they will just start to do it on their own. And it clearly becomes just a tool that they realize they can use.
That's so incredible. And as a mom of 2 kids, how have your kids responded? As the
Not as
daughters
well.
of Annaka and Sam Harris, I mean, that's something that's obviously you've applied in their lives, I'm guessing at quite an early age. Talk about how
Yeah.
old your kids are and how they've responded.
They're now 7 and 12. I'm sure any parent who's listening will know it's almost impossible to teach your child something that you're passionate about. So it's something we've struggled with a lot. What I've been lucky about is that their schools, I mentioned, their preschool and also now their elementary school, were very interested in bringing mindfulness education to the school. So I was able to volunteer for my daughter's classes. After a certain point, it didn't feel appropriate anymore. But so I followed my first daughter's class, kindergarten through second grade. And yeah, no, it's like anything else. It's like when you start piano lessons early and you realize, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, they can really start to understand how to play the piano. And if they start at that age, it kind of just gets in um, to it becomes part of the way their brain develops and it gets incorporated. And so it becomes that much easier for them to access if they choose to go on and continue to study piano. It's similar to that. So I feel lucky that they both have the concepts and some experience of meditation through these classes that I volunteered for in their schools. It is very difficult to get them to sit down and meditate with me at home, and I have to resist um, putting pressure on them. And it's actually in my tips and recommendations on my website. It's very important to not require that a child sit and meditate. And so it's just for a variety of reasons, one of which is it is such a self motivated experience and tool that it just literally won't work. They won't be meditating if they're not internally motivated to do it themselves. And of course, like anything else, you don't want to turn them off of it by making them do something they don't want to do. So yeah, so I mean, for my own children, I would say I actually sometimes feel jealous when other parents and will email me and talk about how useful my meditations have been because I can't really use them in the same way that other parents have.
And do you and your
I need to
your
get
husband meditate in front of the girls? And do you find that that's been helpful for helping them, see that mommy and daddy are doing it and get interested in what that is?
Yeah. I do, and I have. I need to do it more now since we've been all stuck at home for a year. It's not the thing I think to do most often, but yes, and that's the number one thing I recommend to parents actually is modeling, and that is I've seen over the years, and I've heard from other meditation teachers that is the best way to get children interested is for them to just see you doing it and for them to see the effect on your life. Um, so since our first daughter was born, I have a little meditation area set up actually in a play area in the house where there's baskets of Legos and things like that. And it's usually for a very short time, but I'll set a timer for 5 minutes or so and just sit and meditate. It's a useful exercise, even for an experienced adult meditator, to not sit in a quiet place, but to sit in the midst of everyday life and let that be there and meditate through that experience and meditate through the child poking you on the shoulder or coming and opening your eyes or saying, "What are you doing?" But yes, I can't know at this point. They're both still so young. But I do believe that they're being exposed to it and hearing me talk about it and seeing us do it and the value we place on it. I am sure that we'll find out later that influenced their lives. Yeah.
For sure, for sure. And I want to come back to your meditation story. You talked about, I think it was age 22 or 23 when you went on the 10-day silent retreat. Let's go back before that though, and we'll work up to that. Talk about your early influence into meditation and what style you did and how that unfolded.
Yeah, it wasn't so linear, and it's interesting. I've now spoken to many athletes who had a similar experience to my experience. I trained as a dancer my whole life, in ballet, and then later in modern dance. And I actually ended up I went to UCLA, but while I was at UCLA, decided I really wanted to pursue a professional career in dance, and so I transferred to NYU to be in New York and to be part of a dance conservatory. And I go back this far just because I realized after I started formally learning to meditate that a lot of the concentration element and the element of kind of practicing continually being in the present moment is absolutely part of dance training and performance training. And so I think a lot of athletes, actors, dancers take to formal meditation training pretty easily because there are many elements of it that they've already trained in. Um, and so yes, so I'd had that training, and then I actually had an ankle injury, and yoga was prescribed by the physical therapist. And it was really, again, when it was just when yoga was becoming somewhat popular. I remember going to one of the first yoga works studios. They were renting out an office that had carpeting. It was, it was just the beginning days of yoga being popular in the West. Um, and there was a meditation at the end of each yoga class. And the teachers that I started gravitating towards actually made and as I believe it's traditionally supposed to be practiced, made the entire yoga practice a meditation. So at this point, I was dancing 8 hours a day, sometimes more if I was in long rehearsals, and doing yoga, I think 5 or 6 days a week. So I was basically, without realizing it, doing an extraordinary amount of meditation training. um, and it wasn't really until, and I think I was aware of the benefits, and I was aware of the peace that was the meditation, that was the being in the moment. And I'd always been fascinated by consciousness, and how the brain works. And so that all kind of fed um, into my interests and what I was gravitating towards anyway. Um, and I can't remember actually if I sought out formal teachings before I met Sam, but it was definitely clear that once Sam and I became friends and then became romantically involved, that this was like what we talked about on our first date. And he had had many formal meditation teachers, and so he started introducing me to teachers, and at that point it became, clear practice. And it was around that time that I sat my first meditation retreat.
Okay, I'm just trying to put the timeline together. How old were you
I
when
was
you met
young.
Sam?
Yeah, I was 22 when I met Sam.
Okay, how did you guys meet?
We were set up. We were set up on a blind date. Yeah.
And then around that time, it didn't take you long, you ended up doing the 10-day silent retreat.
Yes,
Got it. And did you guys do that together?
we did actually. Yes.
Nice. Take me through that. That's I mean, at that point, you'd been in the realm of meditating for a long time. You talked about the dance and how that's kind of incorporated in. But I mean, deep meditation was still kind of new to you, right? That's a big undertaking to go
Yeah,
for
it
10
was
days.
terrifying.
Talk
Yes.
about that. Talk about
Actually, you
your
know what?
feelings
I'm
before.
sorry. I misspoke. My very first retreat was 5 days.
Okay. Was this
Um,
at 22 or 23?
yes.
Perfect. Take us through what you're feeling going into it and what that was like.
I now realize when I think about the fear, I don't think I could have committed to 10 days the first time. Um, so sorry, I'm just hesitating because while you were talking, I thought of something else that would be useful to mention, and of course I've forgotten. Hopefully it'll come back to me. Um, I was just curious if you've ever done a meditation retreat or if you practice meditation at all, as I get into all of these details.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I have never done a retreat. It's something I've, talked to a lot of the guests on the show about, and I'm definitely open to the idea.
Hmm.
Um, I've been on and off of meditation for a long time, for years, and I go through spurts where I really get into it, and it's usually through an app and doing a guided meditation.
Yeah,
And yeah, just getting into your book and preparing for this interview, I'm ready to be spurred back in. It's been some time off right now, and I'm ready to be spurred back into it and to
yeah. You have a young
undertake it.
child too, right?
I
Is that
do, a
right?
young daughter who's 1 year old, so right now wouldn't be an ideal time to take time and go away. And we're thinking, our intention is to expand the family, so it's, probably not gonna
Might
happen
be a
for a
little
bit.
while. Yeah,
Yeah, but in the
yeah,
meantime, your book and preparing for this has reignited that passion in me to get back into a regular meditation practice at home. Again, guided meditation, see where that goes. But it's been on and off for me for a long time, and I find a lot of the people I talk to, whether I'm interviewing them on the show or just other people in my world that are in health and wellness, they have this similar pattern of getting in and out of meditation.
yes,
And
it's
that's
true for
that's
me
to
as
me
well.
weird because I and we, I'm sure, know all the benefits, and it's such a free and easy thing to do. It's like, why is there that resistance? So maybe you can talk to that. We got a lot of different areas we can veer off here, but
Yeah.
let's maybe start there. We'll talk about meditation and why people tend to come in and out of it like I do, and then we'll get into that retreat and what that was like.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's something I think a lot about. I come back to. For me, it really became more difficult after having children. And I actually just almost 1 year ago exactly, I sat my first retreat since I had children, and our older daughter's 12. If you add a year of pregnancy, that was 13 years of not sitting a retreat. And sitting meditation retreats to me feels like at very top of the list of the most important things I've ever done, the most transformative things. I mean, it's clearly so important and enjoyable, even though it's difficult. So yeah, it was. I feel very lucky that I was able to get that one in right before the lockdown, and I'll get back to it as soon as the world becomes normal again. um, First, I'll say actually that Dan Harris, I don't know if you follow his work at all. He wrote the book 10% Happier. He talks about the difficulty of maintaining a practice, a regular practice. And he does a really great job of it. And his second book is really devoted to that. And I'm forgetting the name right now, but it's a 10% happier book. I think it's like a how to. But I don't know if you know about how he wrote this book, but he was basically addressing this question, why do people have a hard time sticking with it? And he got on a bus with a meditation teacher and they drove around the country and not only spoke to people about their experience, but tried to find ways to get around the things that were making it difficult for them. And that's an incredibly useful book. And I think everything they touched on applies to someone, to whatever your obstacle is. I'm sure it was touched on in that book. Um, it's it is hard work. So it is again like learning to play an instrument or a language, where it really requires an energy and a concentration, and it's something that kind of by definition you keep failing at. So I think for some people, I mean, there's a wide range of reasons, but for some people, it's about the fact that in the way it's not like playing the piano, it's you don't just kind of linearly keep getting better and then have this gratification of now I can play this piece, and I can look back and see how much better I am now than I was a year ago, and so Um, that kind of experience is not present, in addition to the fact that it requires so much work. um, and I think part of it is just cultural. I think we are so busy, and technology has only made us busier, and we have to carve out the time to do it. And so, it's just kind of a combination of all of these factors that make you have to have a lot of willpower to to carve out that time for your life and to do it, and in that moment to not say, oh well, it's more important for me to do A, B, and C for the kids, and there's always something that you could do instead. So
That makes sense. And Dan, I've read his first book. I knew he had a second book. I haven't gotten into it or didn't know what it was about, but it sounds fascinating. I'm gonna have to check that out.
I highly recommend it. Yeah,
Nice. So
especially for that question. um,
interesting. So let's come back to the retreat. You're going into your first 5-day retreat. Talk about the feelings beforehand and what that experience was like.
I was extremely anxious and almost didn't go many times. So I should also correct. So this first retreat was a 5-day retreat. It was not with Sam. I went with another friend. It was her first retreat also. And it was interesting. It was interesting to me that I was so afraid because I didn't even know what I was afraid of. I'd spent hours and hours and hours in meditation. Um, there is just something so intrinsically for human beings, and I think also for human beings who tend to be more anxious, as I do and always have, um, to not have any of your crutches or any of your support for when you're feeling vulnerable or in any way emotionally unstable, because what you're doing is just being with it. And that does turn out to be magically transformative. And it does turn out to be this paradox where being with pain and being with uncomfortable feelings, physical or emotional, when you surrender to it, it actually makes it a little easier to tolerate, which is the opposite of what we're normally doing, which is just trying to get away from it. Um, but that I think that's really at its core quite terrifying. Um, and what happened to me actually on the first day surprised me, and I still don't totally understand what it was about. I started crying and I could not stop. Um, and I'm not a big crier. It's actually been, based on my life and the difficulties I face, it's actually something it takes a lot for me to cry. And I don't know, a couple hours into the first day, and I just broke down. And it was really, I mean, it was kind of a scary, I don't know if you've had a feeling of grieving for someone you've lost, where it really consumes you, where you have kind of a fear that it will never end. There's this deep well of sadness. And so I went to one of the meditation teachers. You can write a note if you need to speak to someone, and they'll set up a time for you. There are teachers that are available for you to talk to, and on these retreats, I should also say, it's silent the entire time. But usually every day or every other day, you have a scheduled meeting with a meditation teacher to check in about how your practice is going, and they give you advice. Anyway, I basically raised my hand like I need help. Um, and she ended up scheduling a meeting for me and a few other people. And before they even got to my turn, I was already sobbing. And she said, "Let's start with you." And I said, I don't know what's happening. I'm not thinking sad thoughts. I have no idea what's happening. I can't stop crying." And she said, "That's totally natural. That happens a lot. That's normal." I don't remember if she had an explanation for it, but it was definitely helpful to hear that that was just something that can happen. Um, and it's interesting because at that point in my life, one of the things I really struggled with was um, feeling like I needed to be a very strong and tough person, both in my career and in my personal life, and because how I'd grown up. And I'd had kind of this. I mean, it's funny in today's climate, but it was like this sexist, um, what's the word, judgment of myself, that I didn't want to be, weak in a feminine way. And at the end of that circle, one of the men who had been in that circle came up to me and he said, "I just want to let you know, I've done many of these retreats, and that happens to everyone. It happened to me once. I cried for 3 days or something." And there was something that was so helpful to me about, and beginning the retreat that way, about kind of, it's all, whatever, you don't know what will happen. It's unpredictable. The thoughts come, the emotions come, and this obviously true of life as well. You just kind of don't know what the next moment will bring. um, but letting yourself be with whatever is there, without judgment, which is such a key point. That it's almost like I fast tracked myself in that first day for the rest of the retreat, and that really became what the retreat was about. And that's partly what's so wonderful about having 5 days or 10 days, is you can't run away from it. So whatever comes up, it is kind of this endless experience of just facing and facing and facing. And now you're in the next moment and you're eating and you're getting ready for bed. And in all of those moments, the intention is to be right where you are, without judgment, and to just, watch the movie, the movie of your mind. And there's something so powerful about spending that many hours doing it. I'm not sure, I'm sure if you did some kind of musical retreat, there'd be a similar effect of just devoting that many hours to something in a row. But there's something unique about meditation. It's so unlike the way we usually use our brains, that a retreat, I mean, everyone I've spoken to has this experience where I had been meditating for many years, hours a day at that point. Um, the difference between sitting an hour or two a day for weeks on end and just doing a 5 day block where that's all you do, they can't even be compared. It really is. I'm convinced that it actually does something to your brain. It kind of changes your brain in a permanent way. And Sam will say, and I've had other friends say this, and it's been my experience as well, that when I go back to sit my next retreat, what if it's been 2 weeks or 5 years, or now I've discovered 13 years, there's a feeling of just picking up where you left off. There really is kind of some shift that has happened that you just kind of return to. Um, and I don't know anyone, and it seems impossible to me that that could be accomplished, in a daily sit practice, even if it's for many hours a day.
Well, it's interesting talking about taking that 5 days and disconnecting. I would say that's gotta be more important these days than ever before with how connected we are with emails and the internet and social media, and it just seems like, the busyness is something that's being praised in today's world in a general sense, and I'm guilty of it too. I'm a go, go, go person and type A, and I can only imagine what that would do on a deep level to take that amount of time and slow down and just be with my thoughts. So, yeah, I just wanted to highlight the fact that these days I can only imagine the difference between, say, even, in the 50s or 60s when the world was so much different.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it makes it more challenging for people to drop in, and I think we need probably longer retreats than we used to. It might be might be important to start with 10 days rather than five now. I think there's just a lot of unraveling that has to happen before, you get to that place. But even though it's a more radical shift from our day to day life, I think the most radical shift is kind of timeless. I think, there's maybe an extra like 5% or something tacked onto that with email and the rest of modern life, but it is such an extreme thing for the human mind at any point in history to focus on each moment, moment by moment, and to not get lost in thought. It is, yeah, I mean, most of the work is just that, and I think it was as difficult to do 100 years ago, in most ways than it is now.
I see. And You mentioned something there that caught my attention. The fact that up until that point, you kind of had this toughness to you, this wall. Talk more about where that came from.
I'm a pretty personal, I mean, I'm a pretty private person, I'm just gonna say. So I don't really wanna get too much into the details, but it's just, my childhood, what my father was like. I'm sure many people had the kind of father I had and can relate. I was also the oldest of 3, and so I was, growing up, I was kind of the adult when there wasn't an adult available.
Did you have a profound shift then? You experienced that crying and that profound experience early on in the retreat.
Yeah.
Did that change going forward after you left the retreat?
Yes, absolutely. And that's one of the interesting things about meditation is it is kind of fundamentally a shift in how you use your brain and how you experience the world. But there are also all of these psychological benefits, and that's obviously one of them. Is it's kind of like a fast track for working through, or maybe just another method of working through ways in which you feel stuck or ways in which you're limited in your life. Um, yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
No, it's great. I want to talk about your book Conscious now. And you mentioned earlier that you've been fascinated by consciousness for throughout your life. So I'm just curious, like, do you have any idea where that stems from?
It's interesting. It's only recently that I feel like I really understand how it was all connected, how all of my interests. I mean, the dots are not so difficult to connect anyway. You can kind of see the crossover and all of it. But I now realize that it was my curiosity about what everything is. It's kind of like the natural physicist in me, just wants to understand the truth of reality and as many details as I could absorb. And consciousness, I think, because it is almost in some ways everything to us, right? I mean, if we were AI and we were not conscious, if we were, if everything were the same and we were doing all the things we're doing and creating all the things we're creating, but there was no experience there, if we weren't having an experience of being human, in a sense, there wouldn't be anything, and there certainly wouldn't be all of the things we experience that we're interested in and that we're curious about. And so it really all is kind of part of the same thing. I think my curiosity about what is this universe? How did it begin? What is it made of? When you break this table apart, what's inside and then what's inside that? Um, Consciousness is just a part of that because it is a part of everything I can wonder about. Um, and it's interesting now I'm working on this series about consciousness, and I find that I'm mostly talking to physicists and realize that, well, I'm kind of jumping to the end of my book, which is where my audio series begins. But my as you know from reading my book, I'm open to the idea. I'm completely agnostic about it, but I'm open to the idea that consciousness is perhaps not what we have assumed it is in terms of being a complex phenomenon. And it's possible that it is part of the fundamental stuff of the universe. And that's really just a question that I think we have many reasons that make it worth exploring at this point. And so a lot of my work right now is talking to physicists who I trust, who are skeptical of this idea and who are open to this idea so that um, we can see if there is a path forward where that makes sense, where we can talk about consciousness being part of the fundamental stuff of the universe rather than something that emerges, in the most complex processing. And that work has made me realize how my interests are connected as well. The fact that that is an open and legitimate question at this point in time for physicists and neuroscientists um, tells me that it's part of what's mysterious about life. It's part of the unanswered questions, and in my mind, it all kind of fits into the physics category.
So what you're touching on there, just to elaborate a little bit, is the panpsychism.
Yes, although you notice that I didn't use the word.
That's why I had to bring it up
I
because
know.
you're circling it, but you didn't
Yes,
actually
well,
nail it down.
yeah, no, and actually, I have really decided in this new work that I'm doing that it is such not a useful term. But I'll explain. Panpsychism was coined in the 16th century, and it, to me, it's a very antiquated term. There are many different theories within panpsychism, most of which I would not subscribe to, even slightly. They were developed, and the term came about at a time when we knew very little about the structure of reality. And we've come so far in our scientific understanding of the world since then that it doesn't seem to me like a useful tool, on top of the fact that it sounds so crazy and it's so hard for us to get our minds around the idea that consciousness could be fundamental. So the place I've gotten to actually is really, if panpsychism had never existed, if no one had ever even had this thought before, it would be a totally legitimate question at this point in physics to ask, is it possible that consciousness fits in to the fundamental picture of things? And especially right now, as we're kind of hitting walls with all of the different interpretations of quantum mechanics and not really moving forward in the way that we hoped by now. Um, it seems to be an even more legitimate question when most physicists really believe at this point that space and time, sometimes just space and not time, but that space and time are emergent properties of something more fundamental, that really the reality that we experience as human beings through our perceptions um, is very different from the underlying reality, including the fact that space is very likely emergent and not something that's fundamental. So when we think about what the fundamental nature of reality is, for us to even imagine something that doesn't contain space is, almost impossible. And many, I include myself in this category now. The physicist Carlo Rovelli talks about it in this way. There's kind of a camp of physicists. Nima Arkani Hamed is someone who Donald Hoffman refers to a lot. Will just say that they believe that both space and time are not the fundamental stuff. And um, so I think when we're at this point when there are so many mysteries in front of us and there are so many questions that haven't been answered, and there are many reasons from the side of neuroscience and the philosophy of neuroscience to wonder whether consciousness is not an emergent phenomenon at a complex level. It's simply a question that I think is a legitimate scientific question at this point. Is consciousness fundamental? And panpsychism is an ism that you have to subscribe to. It's almost like a set of beliefs. And so yeah, so for me, I have kind of stopped talking about it that way and just pose it more as like a modern a modern scientific question that I think would have come up even if no one had ever thought of it before.
And I think it's important to point out too, if consciousness is a fundamental thing in everything, we can differentiate that from critical thinking. I think that's an important
Oh,
distinction to
sure.
make so we can
Yes.
kind of fully grasp the idea that is possible. So kind of differentiate how that piece fits in.
Yeah. So consciousness is a word that can be used many different ways, and a lot of people think of consciousness as being akin to complex thought, as you said, or much higher order processing, like self-awareness. People often think you're only conscious if you're self-aware. Consciousness, the way I use the term, is in a much more simple sense, and it's really just experience or felt experience. So if a worm has any experience at all, if a worm is not completely unconscious, the lights are out, it's a robotic worm is the same as a living worm, and there's absolutely no felt experience entailed in being that organism. Um, that is a different state of affairs than there being some felt experience. And so if we imagine that a worm is conscious, or a bee is conscious, or some, much simpler life form, um, there is no self-awareness, there's no complex thought, there aren't these other things. And it's this piece of felt experience that is so mysterious in the universe. So it is the thing that we don't know how to explain. And yeah, so I mean, at this point, I think it's helpful to just explain the mystery in the mystery of consciousness as I talk about it, which is that, at some point in modern science, we realized and discovered that everything is made of the same ingredients, that we are stardust. This beautiful phrase is literally true. And so the mystery is why any collection of atoms, we're all made of the same atoms when you break everything down, why when atoms come together and get configured in a very specific way, does it suddenly become something that it's like to be that matter from the inside, that a group of atoms suddenly have a felt experience entailed in their being, in their behavior. And so this turns out to be a much harder question than than I think we thought it would be, given the advances in modern neuroscience. I think it seemed we all thought, it seems mysterious in the way that if you didn't understand how a light bulb works and you turn a switch on and suddenly the room is flooded with light, that seems magical and mysterious. But once you understand the details, once you understand electricity and how light bulbs are constructed, um, it seems much less mysterious. You understand how that process takes place. And so I think many people thought that consciousness is analogous to that. That once we understand the brain well enough, we'll understand how this new property comes to be. And it really hasn't been the case. And I would argue that um, the opposite is true. Actually, that it's the closer you look, the less the less obvious it seems that it's even originating in brain processing.
I want to talk more about that in a sec here, but looking at the panpsychism view being very extreme one way, would that mean even the atom, the most fundamental particle, would have consciousness?
Yes, I mean, so there are different people are coming at this in different ways. There's one theory called integrated information theory, which was created by Giulio Tononi. He's a neuroscientist, and Christoph Koch is also very involved in this theory. Um, that's one theory that, yes, would have not all atoms, some atoms, depending on their configuration, depending on their what system they're a part of. But yes, under their theory, in some cases, something as small as an individual atom would contain some minimal level of experience. When we talk about these types of theories, it is really important. You alluded to it, but it is important to continually remind yourself that when we talk about consciousness, we're simply talking about experience, felt experience, sentience. It could be, as simple as just the feeling of heat or pressure and nothing else. That's it. There's just some sensation of heat or pressure. And so when we talk about consciousness being a part of a much more simple system, or being in an electron, we have to be really careful to not anthropomorphize that and imagine electrons are thinking thoughts and have ideas. And that's not at all what anyone is suggesting when they talk about consciousness being fundamental. But yes, I tend to think, as I look at these different theories and think more and more about it myself and interview physicists who are interested, I tend to think that if it is fundamental, it would be pervasive, um, possibly even kind of originating as a field that is more fundamental than space and time. And so there's some way in which um, our perceptions of space and time are ways of interpreting information, kind of the human brain's way of interpreting information that gives us, in a sense, an illusion of what's actually out there, which is true of so many of our senses. Anil Seth has a new book coming out. He's a neuroscientist, and it's wonderful, and it's all about human perception, and how the brain kind of creates the perception of self. He's one of the best neuroscientists to talk about self and how the brain, how all these different processes in the brain give us this illusion of being a self, a single self that moves through time. And so it's interesting that many of these brain processes, already we know, give us very useful information, but don't actually show us what is out there um, in a more direct sense.
Well, it's interesting as we talk about on a fundamental level, consciousness being in an atom or in a cell. Where this becomes even more interesting is to think of a complex being like a human that's made up of a number of cells, which forms tissues, which forms organs. It's
Yeah.
like if consciousness is coming together, so many, small consciousnesses, or I'm probably butchering that term, but if there's different consciousness coming together to form a being like a human being, what happens? Are we just an amalgamation of all those different consciousnesses to form what I'm experiencing right now?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that is something that is kind of debated among philosophers. And there's a term for it. It's called the combination problem. And I actually just wrote a piece in Nautilus magazine about this. And I'm continuing to write about it. I'll have another piece out soon. I actually believe that this is a false problem, that it's part of multiple illusions that we experience that make us think about it in this way. But it's a very natural question, and it is the combination problem. So the problem of how, if there is consciousness everywhere, how do these smaller bits of consciousness come together to form this new consciousness? Many philosophers who've been working on this topic for a long time believe that that's really the biggest obstacle to believing that consciousness is fundamental. And I really do see it as a false problem, beginning with the fact that the experience of being a self, is an illusion to begin with. And it's a very, very tough illusion to break through. Meditation is a wonderful tool for breaking through this illusion. But there are all kinds of brain processes that have been studied now. And often when a brain process like binding, I can explain what binding is. But when brain processes go awry, when something goes wrong, it often gives us insight into what our brain is doing in the first place to create that experience, and to show us that that experience is something that's created by the brain and not a direct line of information from the universe. So binding is kind of category of processes by which our brain pulls together different sensory information, sights and sounds, colors, shape, and and gives us this single experience. So the example I use in my book is when you're playing tennis. If you hit a tennis ball with a racket, the experience we have is of hearing and seeing and feeling the ball hit the racket all at the same time, which is very useful for us. But the truth of the matter is, sound waves don't travel as fast as light waves. So the light waves hitting the retina are actually getting there more quickly than the sound waves are reaching our ear. Also, those signals, once they enter the body, take different amounts of time to reach different parts of the brain. Um, Same with the motor signal coming from my hand and my arm as the ball hits. So the brain actually does something under the category of binding, where it syncs all of these things together and kind of presents you with this single moment experience where all these things are happening at the same time. Those types of processes can go awry. And so it's usually under the category of agnosia. There are different forms of agnosia. If you have brain damage, where sights and sounds are no longer synced. Where, I mean, there's a whole list of ways this can go awry. But all of this contributes to, and along with many other processes, contributes to this experience of being a solid self, that is not in actuality what is physically happening. Our brains are just processing, continually processing information. There's no self at the center of that that's driving all the processing. Um, and it's this very strong sense that I'm a self, that my 3-year-old self, in some sense, that core self in the 3-year-old me is still with me here, which is not the case, but it's a very strong feeling we have. And even, I'm someone where in meditation, this I regularly break through this experience. I can have a very clear experience of not feeling self. And yet, in most of the moments in my life, I still am living with this illusion. And so, to me, the combination problem comes out of that illusion. It's the idea that there are kind of all these individual selves experiencing things. And I don't see it that way at all. I really see it. The analogy I've been using lately is like bubbles in a pot of boiling water, where water is consciousness. So water is pervasive, and experiences arise one moment after the other. An experience, by definition, I mean, this is the interesting part and where it becomes hard to think about, but any experience is by definition private in the sense that it only entails that experience and not other experiences. So, the experience of seeing red, um, it's a single experience, and I can talk about it as, red, um, myself observing red, of the experience of red kind of happening to me. But I think the more correct way to see it is that these experiences arise and based on the matter present and based on how the matter is configured, but that there can be multiple experiences within my own brain. And which of those come as an experience of myself, are distinguished from others, but that, yes, so if it is true that consciousness is fundamental, there is just a cacophony of experience happening, just in this little section of space time that is my body, right? That it's not all of the things that the I and me, the experience that entails all of the memory and all of the things that are kind of shared, from one moment to the next, is one stream of experience, but there are others that are not even necessarily streams. And you can think about memory as being a crucial piece of this. If I pricked your finger right now, but then you had no memory of it after the fact, you wouldn't say that experience never happened, right? And did it happen to you? It's hard to say. When you start to get deeper into the subject and pick apart all these different areas, you can see where self plays a role in how confused we get when we talk about consciousness. Sorry, I rambled on a long time.
No, that was beautiful, and there's a lot I wanna dig a little bit deeper into,
Okay.
starting with the binding. You were talking about the tennis example there, and I think it's important we go a bit deeper into this and talk about what this means. The fact that information coming from the different senses are coming in at different times, different areas of the body, and then our brain, this computer is taking all that information and putting it together to present one thing to us. So it's actually
Yeah.
kinda like a movie
Yeah.
from different sensory perception. So what this means is that consciousness and our experience is actually getting a lag time of what's actually happening. So there's that time that our computer needs to process what's happening. Then it makes sense of that and provides us with an experience of what's happening in our world. But this is something I want to get further into because this has a profound impact on the human experience talking about it from this way. So let's get into that a little bit. So our consciousness, and you have a chapter that you title, I forget the exact name, but that we're basically along for the show. Our
Along for
consciousness
the ride is the
along for
title.
the
Yeah.
ride. There you go.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
our consciousness and our perception, our experience is actually the last to become aware of that experience. So let's get into this and talk about free will and what this all means.
Yeah, David Eagleman speaks really clearly and beautifully on this topic. He's a neuroscientist, and he has a new book out. I can't remember the name of it. It'll come to me. Um, but he often will say, yeah, exactly what you were saying, that our experience lags behind the physical world, that we're living in the past. It's not that far in the past. It's, what, a 500 microseconds, or something to that effect. But yes, that's correct, that we are not actually in the present moment. And so there are many implications for what this says about how we experience the world, both about self and about free will. Free will is a tricky subject to get into, and I really like to always distinguish free will from conscious will. I think it makes it easier to talk about. Free will being the ability of our brain as a complex system, which is negotiating perceptions from the outside, past knowledge, learning, very complex system for making what we would consider to be choices, and decisions, and having new ideas, and this sort of thing. And I think if we look at free will that way, kind of at a physical level, we can agree there is free will. Although if you get me started, I can eventually I will start talking about why we can't call that free at all. But separate from that processing, which I can just accept, we can call that free will. There's some level of choice and decision making happening at that level. Conscious will is clearly an illusion from what we now understand about the brain. And so, what I mean by that is we all have this sense, it's very closely related to the sense of self. And I see them as two sides of the same coin. So, we have this sense that consciousness itself, the fact of the experience, is causal, is the thing that's creating, that's driving behavior, that I couldn't make a decision if I weren't conscious, that it is not only driving choice and behavior, and what we feel is freedom, um, but that many behaviors couldn't exist without it, that it's somehow intrinsic to the behavior itself. Um, Some of this we don't know. Some of this may be true. But for the most part, especially in terms of consciousness being the driving force, we know that's not the case. And as you said, I explain in my book that it's usually the last to know, right? So all of this processing takes place. Even the experience of will, even the experience of, okay, now I'm going to decide to pick up the glass of water and take a drink. The conscious feeling of having made that decision comes after the brain has done all of the processing to have made that decision. Um, that can be, and I'm tempted to share a more recent study that looked at this. It was in 2013. If you have show notes, I can send you the link to this study.
Sure. Yeah, we'll link it up, but if you could
Um,
get into it briefly at least.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and there are more and more studies like this being done, but this one in particular was about making a choice. They wanted to study something separate from motor movement. So a lot of the studies prior to that had been about action potential in motor movements. Just going to grab a glass, touching a button, whatever it is, and so this, they wanted it to be more cognitively complicated. So they gave subjects two numbers, and they gave them the choice whether to add or subtract the numbers. And they're in an fMRI, functional magnetic imaging machine, um, with goggles on. So they're essentially looking at a computer screen. They're given two numbers. They can decide whether to add or subtract those two numbers, and then go through the calculation. Um, they have a method for marking. There's a sort of timer where they can mark when they made the decision whether to add or subtract. And it turns out that by looking at blood flow in the brain, the experimenters could not only tell at what point the person would make the decision. So they knew ahead of time, when the second hand hits the four, he's going to say, "I want to add." So they could also get the information based on where the activity in the brain was, whether they were going to add or subtract. So this feeling, and the truth is, these experiments are not really necessary to prove the point. At this point, we know so much about brain processing that we just know um, all of this firing has to take place before you have an experience of some kind. And so essentially, and we're not at this point yet, and I don't know what will happen if we get to this point, but essentially, if I had the information, I could know what you were going to think and do half a second before you did it. Um, and that is actually the state of the world, whether or not we can ever have access to that information. I think most people find this to be pretty disconcerting when they first realize it. Um, and I'm actually in this series I'm working on. I'm taking a lot of time actually to work out how this information is framed, because I actually ultimately see this as really profoundly beautiful, and a source of, I always hesitate to use the word spiritual, but a source of spiritual reflection and revelation, and um, in a very positive way. It can be framed in a very positive way, and I think one that's important because it's akin to some of the insights that people have in meditation that are so conducive to well-being, and to having a psychologically healthier outlook on life and way of living life. Um, but then there's the additional piece, which is just I work with a lot of neuroscientists, and I can see this is coming. The truth shows up, especially in science. If you keep digging, you will find the truth. And I would hate for this to have the opposite impact on people when it becomes clearer and clearer that this is the reality, when this much more positive way of viewing things is actually available to us. I mean, I think it's kind of a core insight to a lot of spiritual traditions. And it would be great if we can find some way to navigate ourselves that way through this learning as opposed to the other way.
Talk more about how we could spin that into a positive direction because, and I'd like you just to kind of briefly summarize the way I'm understanding this is that in the end, our brain is basically taking all these stimuli from the environment in and it's its own thing that's causing us to behave and respond in a certain way. And then again, we're just along for the show. So do I have that right? And then two, how do we look at that as a positive thing that we're just along for the ride watching the movie?
So I think, and it's interesting, just as you were describing the state of things, I could start to get the positive experience, first of really seeing it as a realization that you are not separate from the universe. We really walk around feeling like there's me. I mean, forget about our connections with other people, but there's me, and then there's the outside world, and even nature. We enjoy nature. We go for hikes. We think of ourselves as being separate from nature, and we rarely have the visceral experience of the fact that we are nature. We're part of nature. We are embedded in nature, and there is in many ways no sense in which we can separate ourselves. I mean, even you and I have been drinking water this whole time, right? Like, um, and the exchange of ideas, all of that. Like, this conversation has changed both of our brains. We are embedded in nature, in a universe that is all one thing, essentially. And there's something very powerful and positive about having that realization and seeing the brain for what it is, which is this system in nature, which is embedded in nature. I mean, much in the same way that trees are embedded in the ground. And I love those pictures where they show the root systems of trees, and you see how much of the tree is actually underground. Um, in the same way that it's you can clearly see how plants and trees are embedded in their environment. We are just as embedded, even though we move around. And when you see brain processing as another part of nature, um, there's a way in which it can, I think, release us from a lot of psychological suffering. Um, all of I would say most of the ways that we suffer psychologically are based on this idea that we are separate, and that I'm a self, and that myself is doing something wrong or experiencing something wrong or should have something differently in the past. Or I mean, that you can really, and a lot of Buddhist philosophy goes through this incredibly methodically, but at the core of all of those unhealthy ways of being in the world, and thinking about yourself, is this illusion of self and of conscious will. I
Okay.
don't know if I answered your question.
No, yeah, for sure, and it just gets me thinking about an argument that I could see being made by somebody that if they're not the one in control, could the argument be made by a defense lawyer or just
Right.
in somebody's own mind, like,
Yeah.
I was just witnessing myself do this bad thing, like, how would that play out?
Yeah. No, and I think that that's people's main concern, and people usually can often use that as an argument. It's not an argument against what's true. I see it more the way you do, which is it's a concern, and I think this is another reason why it's really important to have this conversation, because people can draw conclusions like that, which I think are false conclusions and obviously not useful for maintaining a civil society. And I go into this at length in my book. Um, First, I just want to say one thing because I'm afraid I'll forget, and then I'll come right back to that. But the last piece of kind of experiencing this as positive, it for me comes down to um, the beauty of being in the position to have we have consciousness. We're having this experience um, of experiencing the universe unfold. Right. This is all just happening, and there's something very special and magical about the idea that rather than it being a completely dark, unexperienced, unfelt universe, at least for us, and who knows how deep it goes, but at least for us, we can experience this unfolding of the universe. And there's a way in which you can kind of let go of things that you normally hold on to that make you, I think, uncomfortable in a variety of ways. But it also then has the effect of connecting you to everything in some sense. Um, but yes, this idea of responsibility. So, in some sense, there's a way in which I actually think it would help society to absorb these ideas about conscious will. Um, I don't think so. So maybe I'll give those examples first, and that is things that are not useful personally for each individual person psychologically, and can be very damaging and can result in all kinds of unwanted behavior, things like um, revenge, desire to punish, to blame, all of these things. I mean, it's one of the reasons why forgiveness is such a powerful um, and difficult um, uh, feeling to access, or I mean, it's more like a process to access, and why it's such a psychologically such a healthier state to forgive than to be consumed with anger all of the time. I mean, just from a selfish perspective, from the person who's experiencing that, um, that is not a great way to go through life. And so, when you can see conscious will as an illusion, it really releases you from a lot of these unhealthy ways of viewing things. But that doesn't stop the actions that we take. So you can really look at the brain like you look at any system. I think in my book, I've been giving different examples, but I think in my book I use the example of a self-driving car. Right, we assume self-driving cars are not conscious and don't have any experiences. It makes no sense to get angry at a self-driving car, right? If something malfunctioned in a self-driving car and it ran into a pedestrian, for us to be able to do the ethical thing and protect human life, we need to know what happened within that system to make that happen. And so I forget the exact example in my book, but it's something to the effect of, if the software was corrupted and didn't work the way it was supposed to, and therefore this car hit a pedestrian, we have one resolution so to make sure that doesn't happen again. If it turns out that there was a school bus with, 50 children in it in one direction, and in order to avoid hitting that school bus, it made the calculation and hit the pedestrian, that's a very different system that was in place. In either case, knowing knowing what the reason was behind it is very important in terms of making sure we more people don't get hurt in the future. And the same is true of a human brain. So some people have a brain tumor that causes them to behave in a certain way. If it's possible to remove the brain tumor, and there are many cases of this, it's quite fascinating. And actually, I read recently that there have been some number of cases of, of COVID affecting the brain in a specific way, causing a kind of psychosis in people at an age that don't normally experience this sort of thing, and people who've never had a history of mental illness before. I don't know if you've read it. There was recently an article in the New York Times. I can send you the link. Um, People who had previously been totally emotionally stable, loving parent. There was one who was a mother, very very similar actually reaction in the brain, which is mysterious in some sense, but also makes a lot of sense. That we don't know what it is about COVID and how it's affecting the brain, but it seems to have a similar effect in terms of this psychosis. And people become paranoid. Each story is slightly different, but they're very similar. They believe people they love are in danger, and in order to save them, they have to kill them. And so there are people ending up in mental hospitals. There's now multiple reports of them all over the world. But of course, this can happen by other types of brain damage, by bacterial infection, where someone who otherwise had a completely healthy, normal brain, something happens, a tumor grows, and suddenly they have this uncontrollable urge to do something like chop off the heads of their children, right? Um, if you know exactly what's causing that, and in this case it's a tumor, and there's a surgery that enables you to fix this person and take the tumor out, and suddenly they're back to who they were, and they can be a loving parent and do all of the things they used to do. It makes no sense for the community to be furious with this person and lock them up and make the rest of their life miserable. There are many cases where deterrence is a tool that is necessary. And so there are many cases where it does make sense to lock people up. It makes sense if there's a brain disease or tumor, or just someone who's born with a brain that causes them to have uncontrollable urges to hurt people. Where if we don't know how to remedy it at the level of the brain, we have to lock them up, right? And also deterrence is a real thing, in the same way that I was talking before about the fact that this conversation is changing both of our brains, right? Um, if someone is tempted to do something that could harm someone else, but they won't do it because they don't want to go to prison, um, that's also a useful tool for creating an ethical society. And to the extent that we can do that without walking around feeling intense anger, I mean, we would be a psychologically healthier society if we looked at everyone who behaved immorally as someone with a brain tumor. And the truth is, on some level, it is that it's we're all walking around with brains. None of us chose our brains. None of us chose our upbringing. None of us, if you become infected with a parasite. I talk a lot about parasites in my book. It's incredibly interesting to see the way in which parasites can affect the brains of their hosts and therefore their desires and intentions and behaviors so that they benefit the parasite rather than the host. And to recognize that this is what nature is, I think can relieve us from a lot of psychological suffering and does not mean we then don't have a prison system or don't have, all of the things in place. I mean, I think the truth is we eventually should have more remedies in place, and more compassionate remedies in place than we do. And society should get safer, ideally, and not the other way around.
So I want to take the self-driving car example and use that analogy and spin it into an area I want to dive into a little bit here. And when it comes to a self-driving car, there can be glitches and maybe it could swerve and hit a pedestrian, or maybe it's making the quote unquote right choice to miss a bus full of kids to hit the pedestrian. But there are things that we can do as owners of that car to maintain that car and keep it performing its best. We can get maybe a software upgrade, we can change the tires, we can get regular oil changes and do maintenance. And I'm interested to see how you'd feel about that, projecting that onto the human being, because now we've talked about how we're basically the last to know when our brain's processing and making us quote unquote do different behaviors. So in my mind, it's like, okay, that's what science is showing, and that's what we have to live with. But there are things we can do to keep that brain propped up and working its best. Things
Oh,
like
absolutely.
getting
Yeah.
8 hours of sleep at night or whatever that is for the individual, fueling it with water like we're doing here and eating the right food. So to me, it's like, okay, this is what the facts are. What can I do that is in my control to get that brain working its best? And there are things like the tumor example you gave where it's like, okay, you can have the tumor removed, but on a smaller level, there's things as quote unquote healthy individuals that we can do day to day to hopefully keep that system making better choices and behaving its best. So I'd just be curious to think what you think about that.
Yeah, yeah, no. And so, I mean, the brain is a very dynamic system. It is firing all the time. It is constantly changing. And just because our conscious experience is lagging behind, I mean, this is where the kind of the problem of I comes in because, I mean, there's really no other way to say it. I'm not blaming you, but you keep saying I, if I'm the last to know, but I wouldn't think of it that way. It's true raising children too. I mean, that's the first place this begins, right? Like everything you nourish a child with, beginning with love, affects how their brain develops. And your brain is just constantly changing all the time. And there are a lot of things we can do, and we learn more and more about this every day, to become healthier, to be able to attain our goals better. I mean, meditation is essentially a changing of the brain. We are training our brains to operate in a different way. Um, there's nothing about the illusion of conscious will that should get in the way of any of that. Your brain, I often, when I talk to people about free will, often the response will be, well, if I don't have free will, then how will I get up in the morning? How will I do all the thing, And the thing that's interesting to me about that question itself is if you realize free will doesn't exist, it never existed and it was never doing anything for you. So maybe the belief in it you think changes the way you behave. Um, but if it's true that it's an illusion, everything you've ever done, you did without free will. so, so these things are possible, right? So, the brain processing still happens. I mean, the truth is, there's no way to do nothing anyway. That's another question that gets asked. Why get out of bed in the morning? If I don't have control over anything, I'll just. But the truth is, there's no way to do nothing. You're always doing something, and so your brain is always making a choice of some sort. Um, you all you do is more and more activity. Even if you're lying in bed, you're doing something with your mind, with your brain, with your thoughts. And the truth is, if you tried to stay in one position for very long, that would become a very difficult activity. you know um so yes, I think, in terms of, and this is why I also think it's important to just, for our everyday decisions and for everyday life, it's important to just put free will in a different category, than conscious will. And so your brain as a system can decide to start meditating 10 minutes a day, beginning today, right? Your conscious experience will just kind of experience your brain making that decision and experience your brain meditating, and it just will be what it is. But there's no way in which that realization should prevent you from making that decision to make the healthy choice, right? I don't know if that really answers your
No,
question in
it
a
does. Yeah,
satisfying
yeah.
way. Okay.
No, yeah, it does. An area I want to delve into before we part ways here is talking about location of consciousness. And there's, I would say, an intuitive assumption made by people that, consciousness is somewhere in the brain and it's somewhere in my skull. I can't maybe quite pinpoint it. But I think this is a really interesting topic we get into, and maybe based on, like you said before, when we have certain, ailments, maybe there's certain brain tumor or some kind of injury to the brain. Has there been any of that in the research showing like any type of location where consciousness or part of consciousness, this area of the brain is essential for that?
Yeah, well, typically it's the cerebral cortex, and there's a ton written about this. Anyone who's interested in getting into the details of the neuroscience. Yes, so we can talk about it on two levels. There's one, kind of the level on which our only method for, probing consciousness is by report, right? So, um, when someone goes under, using anesthesia for um, a surgery, the report we get, is that that person under the anesthesia shows no signs of being conscious. Um, and when they wake up, they have no memory of anything that transpired over that period of time. Um, we can't know for sure. There's a point that some philosophers often make, which is, how can we know the difference between not being conscious and just erasing a memory? And that's an interesting philosophical question, but I think, based on what we know about the brain, in terms of this experience of that you and I are having, of being a continual self that moves through time, where I have held on to certain memories throughout my life, have developed certain ideas and beliefs, and all of that, everything that's available, to this system of everything that I'm conscious of right now, that's largely happening in the cerebral cortex. If you interrupt that processing, it changes the conscious experience. The thalamus is also implicated, so like wake and sleep cycles. So in terms of kind of this flow of experience of selfhood with memory, there's a lot we know about what interrupts that process, what makes that process go away. Um, the other conversation is, if it's possible, if it's true that consciousness is more fundamental and consciousness is pervasive in a sense, then it truly never goes away, but the content, the experience changes. So even if conscious were fundamental, and you give someone anesthesia and it works the way we assume it does, the experiences of that person, of being afraid of the surgery, of you know giving a hug to their wife before they go into surgery, all of those experiences cease. It wouldn't mean that there is no conscious experience in that part of space time at all. But it would mean that those processes, it's not that consciousness is separate from the material world in any sense, at least in the way that I and scientists I'm speaking to about the possibility of consciousness being fundamental. It is somehow related to matter. It is um, the way the matter is constructed. Um, sorry, I should put this the other way. The conscious experience that's being had is dependent on how the matter in question is configured. And so, if you change the configuration of the brain, if you change the electrical firing of the brain, the content of the conscious experience will change. Um, yeah, there are always two ways of thinking about it. When you're open to consciousness being fundamental, there's a way of talking about being unconscious in which there is some form of consciousness still present. Um, but we can still talk about, being unconscious in deep sleep, in terms of that process of being a human brain in that instance changing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think
Okay.
this is a good place we wrap up, and
Okay.
Annika, I really loved your book, Conscious, and really enjoyed the conversation. It's answered a lot of questions and leaving me with a lot of questions that I can
Oh,
ponder
good.
and sit with, which I think is a good thing. And I just thank you for coming on the show. And
Yeah, thanks for having me.
other than getting your book, Conscious, how can people connect with you?
My website is just my name. It's annakaharris.com. ANNAKA Harris.com.
All right, I'm going to link that up and link the book up in the show notes. And thank you again. Really
Yeah,
enjoyed
thank you.
this.
This is a great conversation.
Thank you.